It's not personal, strictly business. Hey everybody, and welcome to the 5th episode of First Time DM Diaries. So, when last we left our heroes, I left them on a bit of a cliffhanger. So they'd found the Stonevale troops which had been trespassing on this side of the river, and were bringing them back to town, when one of them started eyeing up the party, started laughing, and then asked them, "How's Frank?" Now, what could this possibly mean? Does this mean Frank's in danger? What? Do I look like the kind of DM that would put a loved NPC in danger? But before we get to that, a couple things about this session. So first of all, Jeff was unable to join us for this session. I believe he had food poisoning or something. Which was kind of funny because we were texting him beforehand and he said he was down, then he kind of just fell off the face of the earth, so we're like, yep, he's dead. And it's kind of unfortunate he was unable to join us because there's a few parts of this session where I really hoped he would be there, but I'll get into that in a moment. The other order of business is we actually introduced another brand new player. This player is named BMO. So before this session, I actually met up with BMO at work. He was on the clock, I was off, and we rolled up his character. So what BMO is, he is a wood elf ranger, specifically a beastmaster. He or she is hermaphroditic, and they are an outlander. Their goal in life is to spread their seed. I'm not even kidding. We had also determined, because of BMO's connection with nature, he, and or she, is pretty upset with Stonevale right now because they're screwing around with the balance of nature really badly. Although that's not something that's quite revealed to the players yet. On top of this, BMO actually has a giant badger as their companion named Sassafras. So with that housekeeping out of the way, let's jump right into this campaign and see what happens next. So the players had just got asked by one of the Stonevale troops, "How's Frank?" At this point, Petrie, who wasn't there in the previous session, woke up from his mushroom wine coma, and the first thing he hears is, "How's Frank?" He gets mad. Now at this point I had said Huey and Dewey are sitting between these two soldiers to make sure they don't try anything, because remember, Huey and Dewey are both Riverfall troops, and they really want to make sure these Stonevale troops don't try anything. So once Petrie hears this, he gets right in this guy's face. He's like, "What do you mean, how's Frank?" Naturally, this soldier wasn't going to say anything. He just said, "Oh, you know, he's just an old friend of ours." And it became pretty clear at that point he really wasn't planning on talking. Now, I should also mention at this point, both Littlefoot and Ducky were running late to the session, and they told us to just go ahead and start without them, and we could catch them up as soon as they got there. But what this means is, both of the paladins are gone. So the players realize that very quickly, and Petrie says, "Ooh, I'm gonna torture these guys." So literally the entire rest of the ride back into town, Petrie says, "I'm gonna just waterboard this guy the whole time." No objections from Huey, Dewey, or Hork, so they flew back into town. They were not stopping, they were just gonna get to Frank as soon as they could. So I told them, you fly into town, blow right past the gates, almost knock people over on the road, you are just beelining towards this tavern. And as soon as you make it back to the inn, you notice the front door is slightly open. At this point, Hork says, "I'm kicking in that door." So he kicks in the door. And I told him, you see a lot of things really quickly, and your brain processes them one at a time. So the first thing you see is the agent known as Captain Adam on the ground, on his knees, with a longsword stabbed through him. As you pan over a little bit further, you see a Riverfall soldier with a dagger stuck in the side of his neck. You recognize this soldier as Private First Class Lewis. As you continue scanning across the bar, you see multiple tables flipped over, chairs broken. It looks like there was an enormous scuffle. And then you see a trail of blood, which leads over to the wall. And leaning against this wall, you see Frank. He is standing up with a bloody warhammer in his hand, and he looks to you and says, "Well, about f***ing time you showed up." Then he slides down the wall. Petrie and Hork immediately both said, "I am rolling medicine to heal him." They both rolled at the exact same time, and both rolled natural 20s. It was incredible. So I told them both, one of you determined he's still alive, and the other one saved his life. Now at this point, I literally time-outed the session, and I turned to Hork, and I said, you are so f***ing lucky you sent Louis back in the previous session. Because what was supposed to happen, Frank was gonna get assassinated. But as soon as they sent Louis back, I started thinking, wait, no, Louis on his way back. So he's gonna show up, see the assassination attempt, and save Frank's life. And it also worked out because I get to cut the NPCs down. So once they realize Frank's gonna be okay, they immediately turn to these soldiers and ask what the hell is going on here. The one soldier who'd been talking the whole time says, alright, look, I'm not a detective, but if I were to guess, this here agent has been working for us. He's been keeping an eye on Frank. Soon as you guys left, he saw an opportunity to kill him. Well, apparently that didn't work out so hot because you sent this soldier back. To which they then ask, well, what do you have against Frank? To which the soldier says, he used to be one of us. He was Stonevale Special Operations. He defected after the previous war. We've been trying to find him. We did, but then we realized Vulpes was keeping an eye on him. So we had to wait. Almost immediately after he finished that sentence, Hork walks over and murders this soldier. Which is just as well because if they didn't, Huey and Dewey probably were going to because they're pretty pissed off that their friend is dead. At this point, Petrie tells me I am going to march right upstairs. Now, I believe the reasoning was he was going to take Vulpes' head off over this, but he wasn't there for the previous session and I had completely forgotten to mention Vulpes isn't there, so I just let him know. Yeah, he's actually not there. He sent you all a letter saying he'd be in the capital. An interesting thing to note, Vulpes and Petrie probably butted heads the most out of everyone, because Vulpes doesn't really like any of them. The only people he really tolerates is Ducky and Hork because they're both soldiers for this kingdom. Everyone else he just kind of sees as mercenaries and criminals, so they have a very strained relationship. Remember this because that'll come right back. So it was at this point I decided to introduce BMO. Originally I hoped they would stop the carriage on the way into town so that BMO could come out of the forest, but they blew right through that, so I just decided he was going to show up at the bar. Which was cool because we also determined he was a friend of Frank's because Frank would hook him up with the mushroom wine. So he walks into this bar, introduces himself to everyone, and is just looking around horrified like what the hell just happened here? And as soon as everyone caught him up to speed as to what had happened, he's pretty pissed off at these soldiers now too. So they go to the one soldier who hadn't been talking the entire time and forcibly give him a shot of the mushroom wine. That gets him talking. They then begin grilling him like, what is your plan and how the hell did you get on this side of the river? To which, in his drunken stupor, he explains to them, they had been tunneling underneath the river, and that cave, which they did not search, had the entrance to that tunnel. And it was at this point Petrie turned to Hork and said, you didn't search the cave! But this wasn't entirely fair because as I had mentioned previously, the last session had to be cut short, so they really didn't have time to search the cave anyway. Now at this point, they turn to this soldier and say, you're gonna clean all of this up, and for every glass you break, we're gonna cut off one of your fingers. And they had Huey and Dewey supervised the whole time. It was at this point I had said, yeah, he's already broken 36 glasses and it's only gonna get worse from there. So then they said, then they can cut off his toes too, I don't care. Now Huey and Dewey, they're just following orders at this point, but they're not too upset about that either. Remember, their friend is dead. So before going to bed for the evening, they managed to talk to Frank for a little bit. He is up, but he's still hurting pretty bad from the fight. Now it's at this point where Hork asks him, so you used to be a Stonevale soldier? Petrie immediately chimes in and he said, don't you dare. Because at this point, I think Petrie thinks Hork's going to start fighting him because he's from the other side of the river. But I'm pretty sure Hork had no intention of actually hurting Frank, and he did just want to know what actually was the story there. So in the previous war, it started off as normal. They were just engaged on both sides of the river. Riverfall was winning out in the end. Then out of nowhere, these iron giants walked across the river and started destroying everything. Frank is a warrior. He saw no honor in this. So after the war, he just stayed on this side of the river and decided to help out the local intelligence agency. Once Stonevale soldiers caught wind of this and found out where he was, they hatched a plan to kill him. A plan which the players inadvertently thwarted. So at this point, they all just decided to rest for the night and in the morning take care of the other prisoner. So they go downstairs the next morning to check on their prisoner. He's not only missing his fingers, he's missing his toes and several other appendages. At this point, they're like, we did not tell these guys to do all that. I'm like, well, you didn't tell them not to do it. And I actually don't remember a whole lot about this conversation because the information they got wasn't all that helpful, and it wasn't a whole lot they didn't know anyway. But a few things to note. First off, when the players had heard this plan, they were very unimpressed by it. They're like, you guys are such idiots. Why would you think this would even work? It was at this point I had pointed out that this particular soldier is just an engineer. It's just his job to blow stuff up, and he only got a position with the special forces because he's dating one of the mayor's daughters. Another thing worth noting, it was in this conversation where they had discovered that the king of Stonevale, King Philip VI, was actually 14 years old. And pretty much everyone knows he is running the kingdom, but he's not in charge. Who is really in charge is the High Priest Carnelian the Wise, or Carnelian the Mad, depending on who you ask. Remember that name? So they got the information they wanted and just decided we're keeping this guy in the basement, Vulpus can take care of him later. At this point, I had Dewey let everyone know they had received 2 letters in the middle of the night, both slid under the door. The first letter, Petrie wanted to read, and he told me to write it down so that only he could see it. I'm like, okay, sure thing. So I wrote down the letter, and this letter said, "Dear cousin, I need your help. They burned down my bar. Please send money. Frank." He did share the letter to everyone else, and they were laughing their asses off, but they decided they weren't going to let Frank see that. The second letter they had received was very brief. It simply had an address and the time of 9 p.m. Now, it was around this time Ducky had shown up, and they had let him know what had all happened, and he actually doesn't particularly care that they tortured the prisoners, because in his mind, as long as Frank's safe, it's all good. But I had let all the players who were natively from Riverfall, being Hork, Ducky, Huey, and Dewey, you're all pretty familiar with that address. It's down by the docks. I believe it was BMO at this point who wanted to see if he could tell if there was anything special about the letter. I had him roll insight, he rolled decently high enough, and at this point I let him know there's no markings on it, there's no insignias, there's really no way of telling where it's from, but you do notice the letter actually looks very official, as in it's not like scribbled on a napkin or anything. So they all pretty much unanimously decide, yeah, we're going to go to this address at this time, but they had a few other matters to take care of in the meantime. First things first, they go back to the captain of the guard, let him know Huey had died, and make sure he's getting buried with honors, because quite frankly, that man's a hero. On top of that, they wanted guards stationed around Frank's tavern. Now, again, the captain says, why do you need more soldiers? And Hork was not too keen on telling him, so he tries rolling persuasion to no avail, and eventually Petrie just says, look, we found a Stonevale soldier, he's in the basement, we need to keep an eye on him. To which I just had the captain say, oh, well, why didn't you say that in the first place? Of course I'll send a squad down there. So that took care of that. Now, the second order of business. I'm going to take this opportunity to talk about Hoppington. So right before this session, I had actually gotten a physical copy of the monster manual, which you can see behind me, and I was actually showing them what the land sharks looked like. Literally on the next page in that book are bullywugs. Bullywugs are frog people. And as soon as Hork saw that, he had asked, can my next character be a bullywug? And I'm like, yeah, absolutely you can be a bullywug. So we actually started talking it over and figuring out how the stats would work. And interestingly, it's not really all that different from a humanoid. So he had taken the opportunity to flat out roll up a separate character. So from here on out, we're all kinda hoping Hork's gonna die so that this bullywug assassin shows up. Now the reason I bring this up is because they went to the potion shop. Mind you, this is the first time they had considered buying potions at all. But most of the players were pretty sure that this was an ambush, and I mean it was. So they go to this shop, and this shop is run by a bullywug. They had asked if they could purchase some healing potions. I looked up online the different stats for the different potions, and I gave them a price. I think the price I gave them was a certain amount of silver, and Petrie chimed in immediately saying, yeah, that's really low. So I actually went on a separate site and looked up the typical price for health potions. Health potions are expensive, but through some clever negotiations, they actually managed to get quite a few of these on a discount, so I just had this bullywug go, hippity hoppity, it's your property. But I think it was Ducky who wanted to get a bit more for his money and tried to convince the bullywug to give him some free extra potions, and he failed his rill, so I had the bullywug go, hippity hoppity, get off my property. So after this, they all decide they're going to meet up at this address. And here's where decision paralysis kicks in. Now, BMO can use his ranger sense to detect any creature within 1,000 feet of him, or if it's a favored enemy, it's in even wider range. And the original plan was they were going to go there, he was going to detect creatures in the area, tell them what he knew was there, and they were going to attempt to counteract it. The problem was, I had asked them, well, what time specifically are you going there? Because the letter had said to meet at 9 o'clock. And depending on how early they got there, they were going to detect different creatures. So the players went back and forth a bit trying to determine exactly what time they should show up, but eventually they couldn't really come to an agreement, so they just decided they weren't going to show up early, and they were just going to go at the exact time. Which is kind of unfortunate because they did have a really good plan originally, as they were going to show up early, stake the place out, and get into position in the event that there would be an ambush. So they go there at 9 o'clock, and this address is on the outside of a building, but the door to this building is down a 100-foot alleyway. They all know this is a trap, and it is. So smartly, they decide they're all going to stagger across the alleyway. Some people were staying near the entrance, a few people were going to hang out in the middle, and then Hork and Petrie went to the door. Now, I told them as soon as they got to the door, or more specifically started getting closer to the door, they could see the door was boarded up. And as soon as they got to the door, 2 shadows appeared from the entrance to this alleyway. Petrie says, I'm breaking down the door. I had him roll strength, and he broke that door down for sure. Now, there was actually nothing really inside of there. I told him he could tell it was an abandoned boat-making factory. So he and Hork both turn back around, and they see a couple of figures. Figure number 1, a 6'8", heavily battle-scarred orc with a giant battle axe on its back, staring daggers at Hork. This orc is holding in his hand a very large dog. This dog has jet black fur, red glowing eyes, and as it's barking and snarling, you can see sparks and smoke coming out of its mouth. The figure next to him is a bit shorter, holding the same type of dog by the collar, and you can't really make out his face. It's very dark in this light, and his skin complexion's also very dark. But as he slowly brings his cigar up to his face and takes a puff off of it, the light illuminates his face. He is a drow. So after blowing the smoke out, he says, well, you boys have been busy. Let's talk. Now, Petrie's totally cool with talking with these guys, because the last interaction they had went perfectly fine. So he asks, hey, what brings you guys here? Well, unfortunately, there's a few contracts out for you guys. And these contracts are as follows. Contract number 1. For the destruction of public and private property from residents of the village of Lakeview. Contract number 2. For the theft of revolutionary supplies and the murder of a revolutionary leader. From the Calendar Council, 150 gold. To which Petrie interjected immediately, oh come on, Spike wasn't a leader. Which I just had this drow respond, hey man, I don't write the contracts. Contract number 3. Now this contract's from the head office. For the unlawful termination of an employee of the Red Sun. 400 gold. And last but certainly not least, for the termination of enemies of the state. Signed by the Kingdom of Stonevale. Price? Blank. To which Petrie interjects and says, oh come on, that price could be anything. Well, yes, it could be anything, and that's precisely the point. He then tries to negotiate a bit more, saying things like, look, we're about to start a war. Think about how much more money you could get To which the drow just says, well, we at the head office can see the writing on the wall. We're pretty sure war's gonna happen one way or the other. And we may as well cash in on this while we still can. And they tried a little more back and forth, but it was pretty clear this fight was happening one way or the other. Now, before combat actually began, however, I had the drow kind of look at his contract, look back at the party, start counting the heads, look at the contract again, look to the orc, they start whispering to each other. Then he looks back over and says to BMO, Sir or Madame, we actually do not have a contract for you. So if you'd like, you are more than free to leave. Now, he wasn't going to leave, but I kind of added that in there to point out that he wasn't with the party the whole time, so these mercenaries have no problem with him. And this was also why I was upset Jeff wasn't here for this session, because if he were, I really wanted to see what he would have done in this situation. Now granted, I'm sure he would have just played along and been a good sport about it and stayed to help the party, but him being evil and only caring about himself would have made this really interesting. So, I had the drow look to them and say, look guys, it's not personal, strictly business. And he and the orc let go of the hellhounds. Now it's initiative. And it's at this point they all realize they left Huey and Dewey back at the inn. So they forgot Huey and Dewey again. Now coincidentally, it was right around this time Littlefoot showed up to the game, so now he's a part of this combat. Now the first couple of rounds of combat went really well for the players, mostly due to the fact that they heavily outnumber the Hellhounds. Hellhounds aren't really too big of an obstacle, especially for a party of this size at 4th level, but they do have two pretty nasty tricks up their sleeve. One, they can breathe fire. Two, if a Hellhound is within 5 feet of an ally, they get advantage on attack rolls. And wouldn't you know it, they're within 5 feet of each other at all times. So I had one of them do the physical attacks and another one breathe the fire, to which at this point Littlefoot reminds me, hey, I'm immune to fire. And at that point I still believed him. But after the first round of combat, I had pointed out to the players, you hear off in the distance what sounds like a large wagon rolling up. And on top of that, you hear a roar. And it's a roar that sounds like it's 3 different creatures in unison. At this point, Petrie says, oh, is that Cerberus? Not a bad guess, but no. And also in the first round of combat, BMO decided he wasn't even going to try to attack the Hellhounds, and he shot a lightning arrow at the orc who was still standing at the end of the alleyway. Now something I didn't realize till later was, this particular spell is one of those where he would have had to make a dexterity saving throw. And if the orc succeeded his saving throw, it'd be half damage, or if he failed, it would be full damage. So after the 2 rounds of combat, they had killed both of the Hellhounds, which I pretty much figured is exactly how it would play out. And at this point I said, so behind these 2 mercenaries pulls up a large cart with a big cage on the back with a massive tarp covering it. This cart is being driven by goblins. The orc walks over, grabs the tarp, and removes it. Inside of this cage, you see a creature with the head of a lion, the head of a dragon, and the head of a ram. The orc opens the cage, and this creature makes a beeline to you. At this point, Petrie yells across the alley, oh come on, how much did you pay for that? To which the drow replied, don't worry about it. So now they're fighting a chimera. And I want to say this only took about 3 rounds of combat to kill. Now the thing with a chimera is that it can do a pretty good amount of physical damage right off the bat. In fact, it gets 3 attacks per turn. On top of that, it can also breathe fire. However, it has an armor class of 14. So in total it took the party I think 3 turns to take it out, but not before it breathed fire on all of them. And that put Petrie down a pretty good amount of hit points. But before it breathed the fire, BMO used his lightning attack one more time, and it was at this point we realized that it had an area of effect. So I told him to just go ahead and roll twice. We can retcon the previous damage, because he really didn't know, and neither did I. So the previous attack was halved, but this attack he did hit the orc. And then he said, okay, so the drow has to make a saving throw, and if it hits him, he takes full damage. If it misses, he takes half damage. To which I rolled for him and I said, no, because this particular drow has evasion, meaning on dexterity saving throws, which this is, he takes half damage if he fails, no damage if he succeeds. So he just dives out of the way entirely, and it's at this point both of the mercenaries duck around the corner to avoid any more of that. But the party manages to finally slay the Chimera, a bit beat up and looking a little more worse for wear. And at this point, they asked, "Are we out of combat?" I said, "For now, you're out of combat." So the two mercenaries come back around the corner, and they start talking again. Littlefoot at this point offers them, "Look, we don't need to fight. We've already taken out these hellhounds and a Chimera. You can work with us. We will help you get more contracts. And we're about to invade Stonevale anyway. The contract's not going to be any good shortly after this." However, at this point, Hork also countered with, "I'll tell you what, I will fight that orc one-on-one. And if I win, you leave us alone." I am so happy he said that, because in the entire build-up to this session, I had really, really hoped it would come down to Hork and this orc. Because Hork being a half-orc, he's not going to take this from this orc. What, this orc thinks he's better than him just because he's a full breed? He's going to kick this guy's ass. So the drow and the orc look to each other, and the drow turns back and says, "Well, I'll tell you what. Woodrow here would love to defend his honor. So, we accept." Now, before this duel starts, however, Petrie actually goes over to the drow and they just start talking. Petrie has no problem with this guy. I think the way he sees it, he really understands they're just doing their job. So then he asks him, "Hey, so you guys do business on both sides of the river, right?" "Yep, absolutely." "How are you getting on both sides of the river?" So the drow then tells him, "That's the trick. You see, along with being a mercenary company, we also own a shipping company. And this company does business with both sides of the river. So as long as we're on the shipping vessel, we can come and go as we please." So now Hork and this orc war chief square up. It's not going well for Hork, mostly just because he's rolling a lot lower than I was. But man, orc war chiefs can be brutal. Now I should also mention before this fight, Hork whispered to Bimo and said, "Hey, if it looks like I'm about to go down, start lobbing arrows at him." And now Hork's getting really beat up. So Littlefoot has a plan. He says, "I'm gonna cast Compel Duel on this orc." Now Compel Duel means if the target attacks anyone but the person who cast it, he has disadvantage on attack rolls. Well, the way I interpreted that, the orc now is gonna start attacking Littlefoot, because he's been compelled to duel him, and he knows it's not gonna go well if he attacks someone else. Well, the drow sees this. So, because the drow saw this, he knows you guys are cheating. Which, to be fair, the drow was going to cheat too, but hey, you started it. Now, at this point, I had told everybody to roll initiative, but they weren't so sure about that, because quite a few of them were saying, "Well, how would this drow know?" And I said, "Well, you cast a spell on the orc, what do you mean he doesn't know?" To which Littlefoot shoots back, "Well, he would have had to see me cast it, and I don't think he's looking directly at me." To which I shot back again, "Well, he sees his frickin' orc friend disengage from combat and start attacking you. I'm pretty sure he knows something's up." But to settle this dispute, I said, "Okay, wait, tell you what. I will have this drow roll perception. And if he sees it, then it's initiative." I roll a natural 20. Yeah, that's initiative. At which point Petrie, who didn't see what had happened, asked, "What on earth's going on here?" To which I had the drow put his cigar out on his arm, flick it and say, "Well, it looks like the terms have changed." So now everyone rushes into combat to help Hork with this orc. But at the same time, the drow is now in combat. So once Petrie runs off to help, the drow runs behind him and stabs him. And I rolled another natural 20. Something you should know about this drow. He is an assassin. Now, if you look at an assassin in the monster manual, they have a challenge rating of 8. And they have so many bonuses that causes them to do extra damage. And in fact, the only way this attack would have done more damage is if he were within 5 feet of his orc friend, which he wasn't. So I look to Petrie, I ask, "So what are your total hit points?" He's like, "Well, right now I have..." "Oh, no, not your total hit points now. I mean total hit points." Because with flanking and the poison damage, that was about 60 points of damage. Now, I had mentioned in the previous session that I had used poison incorrectly. and I had done it again in this session. So if we were going by 4th edition rules for crits, which we were, I still would have had to roll for the poison damage, and he would have had a saving throw. I didn't do either of those things, so that was 48 points of poison damage alone. And because this dropped him into the negatives more than the total of his maximum hit points, he was literally dead before he hit the ground. So the way I described it was this assassin snuck up behind Petrie, stabbed him in the kidneys, and just grabbed him and looked to him and said, "Not personal, strictly business." And I told Petrie, "I will give you a dying action." He said I just kissed the guy on the cheek. To which I said this assassin just slowly lowers you to the ground, gets back up and starts eyeing everybody else. At this point, combat's going really downhill for the players. So Petrie's flat out dead, Ducky is having trouble hitting anything to save his life, and when he does hit, it's a crit, which, again, par for the course for Ducky. Then Littlefoot goes down, and he's making death saves. Then Hork goes down, and he's back up at 1 hit point, but then he goes down again. BMO is the MVP of this entire session, because between characters going down, he killed the orc. And then, after Hork rolls a 1 on his death save, which gave him 2 failures, Littlefoot rolls a natural 20. So now he's right back up at 1 hit point. So he then heals Hork, who's back in the fight again. Now this assassin is not at all worried about this. He'd taken quite a bit of damage, but he knows he can take them. Now the assassin charges forward towards BMO, and he misses both of his attacks. This gives BMO an opportunity to use his arrow, and he crits. And that was enough to do it. I said you draw back your arrow, let it go, it goes straight into this drow's heart. And he just kind of looks down, looks back up, and blood starts pouring from the corner of his mouth. And he just shrugs and says, "Strictly business," and then falls forward. So now that that's all taken care of, they got to figure out what to do with their dead companion. Well, they look up the rules, and they've got 10 days to resurrect him with a resurrection spell. So now everyone else is screwing around saying, well, we got 10 days, we could wait. But they drag him back to Frank's, in which Frank sees this, he's like, what the hell happened? But they go off and rest for the night before trying to bring Petrie back to life. Now, in the middle of the night, they hear a tapping on the window. It's another messenger owl, to which Hork grabs the letter and then kills the owl. This letter said, "I am sorry to hear what had happened to Frank. He did not deserve that. If it's any consolation, this next piece of paper will provide good news to you." The next piece of paper in this letter is an order for immediate mobilization of troops for preparation of war against the Kingdom of Stonevale. Signed by King Jude of Riverfall. They're going to war. So the next morning they go to the local temple, the Temple of Soul. Now I should mention that in previous sessions I had pointed out to the players that the god of this particular kingdom of Riverfall is Soul, and the goddess for Stonevale is Luna. This becomes important very quickly. So they go to the Temple of Soul and are greeted by Father Solaire. They hate Father Solaire. They walk in and he says, "Welcome to the Temple of Soul, my brothers. Praise Soul." To which they show him their dead comrade, and I had Father Soul just kind of look him over, look back up and say,
"This is the deadest I've ever seen."
And Father Soul is a cleric. He's a cleric that I've statted personally, but he's not high enough level to cast resurrection spells. So now everyone's like, well, what do we do now? So I had Father Solaire at that point just say, "Well, you can always open your hearts to prayer. Perhaps Soul will hear your cries." So they're all like, "You seriously want us to pray right now?" I'm like, absolutely. Now, I didn't make them actually roleplay out praying, but I really should have done that. What I did do instead, though, I said, all of you who wants to pray, roll D100. And they all rolled D100s, and depending on the amounts they rolled, I actually gave them different bonuses. 2 of them, I believe, got resistance to piercing for the next 24 hours. 1, I think, got advantage on saving throws for the next 24 hours. But then Littlefoot. Littlefoot rolls a 98, and that's exactly what he needed to roll. I said, from everyone's perspective in this room, your eyes roll in the back of your head and you hit the ground. From your perspective, you begin flying. You fly straight up, through the clouds, past the atmosphere, into the stars, past the planets. You start seeing stars. You start seeing light. You start seeing the darkness between the stars. And as you continue on, you see one particular bright light. And as you continue towards that light, everything goes white for a moment. And then you find yourself in a garden. In this garden, a figure begins walking towards you. To which he asks, "Do I feel that I'm in any danger from this figure?" I say, "No, you feel completely at peace, and you definitely get the sense he has no intent to harm you." As he walks towards you, you can tell that this person is a tiefling. Oh wait, no, I'm sorry, he's not a tiefling. He's clearly a dwarf. No. He can't be a dwarf. No. He's a gnome? No, maybe he might be a drow. Or wait, no, he's a dragonborn for sure. So I had him roll perception to see if he could suss out what the hell was going on. He rolled high enough, and what I told him was, it seems like every time you seem to get a reading on what this person's race is, it changes. And when you really start noticing, he's kind of phasing between races. He doesn't seem to have any consistent form. And as he approaches you, he simply says, "Welcome to my garden. What brings you here, friend?" To which Littlefoot then says, "Well, I'm here because my friend is dead." To which this figure responds by saying, "A terrible thing that, but death is a necessary part of life." To which Littlefoot then says, "Is there any way you can help bring my friend back to life?" The figure then says to him, "You are a paladin, aren't you? Tell me, what god do you serve?" To which Littlefoot says, "The one true god." And I had this figure kind of look at him very confused, like, "The hell do you mean one true god?" And by the way, that's a line Littlefoot continues to use throughout the sessions, even though he knows for a fact there's at least two. Now this was something that we'd never really gone into before, because the subject of players' religion really wasn't all that important. Now Littlefoot could have chosen any god he wanted, but I did let him know that as a citizen of Stonevale, he more than likely worshipped Luna, the goddess of darkness, or if you believe the old interpretations, the goddess of death. Both are correct, by the way. So he tells this entity that he worships Luna. So then the entity says, "Well, Luna is an old friend of mine, and there's a particular soul she's been attempting to collect for about 800 years now. It's a gentleman who goes by the name of Carnelian. If you were able to acquire this soul and give it to her, I will gladly bring your friend back from the dead." Littlefoot gladly agreed, and the entity thanked him, touched him on the forehead, and then he went flying back into his body. I actually had him at this point roll a d6. It landed on a 4, so he went 4 slots down on his skills, and I said you now have +1 to intelligence. Now at this point, Petrie immediately comes back from the dead. But then he asks, "Wait, what happened to me when I died?" "I am glad you asked." So I said, "Now Petrie, as soon as you died, it was like a light switch went off then back on again, just really quickly. And the next thing you knew, you were in a black void. You couldn't see anything all around you. However, directly in front of you, you could tell you were seated at a small table. This table is made entirely of silver with a fine silk cloth over it. Before you is a saucer and a teacup. In the center of the table is a silver kettle. You also notice directly above you, you see the moon. It is full and it is really, really bright. That is what's illuminating the area directly around you. And across from you at this table sits a tiefling woman. Her skin is ghostly pale white. Her eyes are completely black. And she just looks to you and is tapping her teacup. At this point, Petrie says, "Whoa, am I tripping, man?" The entity says, "No, you're dead." At this point, I had her reach out into the darkness and grab a book, put it in front of her, flip through the pages, and I told Petrie, she points to what is your given birth elvish name, and says, "Yep, looks like you didn't make it." To which he then asks, "Wait, I'm an elf?" But then he asks her, well, is there any way I can get back to life? I mean, I can still fulfill any duties. To which she just looks up to him and says, well, there is a particular gentleman who I would like dead. He's owed me his soul for about 800 years. Now, if you were to go back up there and get me that soul, I will gladly grant you your life back. He agreed immediately, no debate whatsoever. She then blew him a kiss, and he came back to life immediately. I did let him know, however, that as soon as he woke up, his skin was incredibly pale and cold, and he had a black tattoo of the moon on his neck. He then wakes up and says, dude, I just met God. Then Littlefoot says, dude, me too. And then Petrie says, we gotta kill this mad wizard. And Littlefoot says, dude, me too. We're on a mission from Jesus. And this whole time, Father Solaire cannot believe what just happened, so he's looking back and forth between the two of them, and then passes out. And that's where we ended the session. So this was a very productive session. Interestingly, it didn't run any longer than the others, but wow, they got a lot done. So when it came to the mercenaries jumping them in the contracts, first things first, if they had ignored that letter and not gone to the address, the mercenaries were just going to show up at Frank's bar. And if they had shown up at Frank's bar, the combat would have been entirely different. Mostly because they wouldn't have been stuck in an alleyway. But this also really gave me a chance to show the players, your actions all do have consequences, and I am paying attention to what you do. Now, I had already mentioned this before, but it really was a shame that Jeff wasn't here for this session. First off, because I would have loved to see how he would have taken the offer to not fight these mercenaries, but also I was so excited for him to use the Wand of Wonder. But I guess I just had to wait one more session for that. Now, when it came to killing Petrie, everything worked out fine in the end, so nobody was really upset. But while we were still in the middle of combat, it's then I realized I had screwed up entirely, and quite a few of the players realized that too. Now, thankfully, Petrie was a good enough sport about it that he wasn't going to try to retcon or anything, and you know, it is what it is. But yeah, I really screwed that up. He should not have died in that encounter. And what's really interesting about that encounter, this just goes to show how entirely badass my party is, because I had created that encounter expecting Huey, Dewey, and Jeff all to be there, and they still won. Now you may be wondering, if the party had wiped, what would I have done? Well, I had that whole Luna thing in my back pocket for quite a while, so if the party did wipe, they all would have got that mission from Luna. But probably the biggest success of this particular session was I had managed to take one plot and move it over to another. Now, from the beginning, the goal of this party was to start a war between these two nations, but they had already done that. So now, what do? Do they just go out and fight? Well, sure they could, but why not give them a reason? And I will say, both Petrie and Littlefoot have been super on board with this plan to kill Carnelian. So with war on the horizon, where does this party go from here? Oh, you're gonna love the next episode, believe me. So ladies and gents, join me for the next episode titled, Let's Rob a Bank. Be seeing you.